Hi everyone. Last month I did a video on building a scrap stash, and I will drop the link in the notes for this video. But now I kind of wanted to continue that and show you a few other tips. So these are tips on how to take that scrap stash that you built and make blocks, borders, binding, anything interesting with all of those scraps. So let's get started. So first of all, remember how I told you that what I do with my fabrics is I cut them down into smaller sizes. These are some fat quarters. And then these are how I do my fat eighths. I showed you that in the last video. The one thing that and here's the strips, 2.5 inch, and then I have other tubs with 1.5 inch strips. The other thing I forgot to tell in that video was I also have a bin of scraps like this for many purposes. And these are scraps that come from pieces that can't be cut into strips. And so I just cut them into scraps. They're odd pieces. You probably could cut some of these into strips, but I also save them because you'll find out I use them for things like applique on quilts. And then I also use them to make what I call blocks that are for testing. So say you have a pattern that you want to make, but you don't know what colors you want to use. So what I do is I take these scraps that I have in my different bins, and I make the block that I'm thinking about making in different color combinations. This way I can see how the block is going to look in different color combinations without cutting into the fabric that I bought for the project, or that I'm thinking about buying for the project. This way you know it's going to look good, even though it's not the exact same fabric, it's the same color that you're thinking about. So I like to do that often because I think it saves fabric, and then I'm not cutting into something that I think is going to be not looking like I thought it would look. So then you're going to have all these what I call orphan blocks laying around after you have made your samples. So what can you do with blocks like these? You're going to have a bunch of them. You're going to collect them all. You could either make a fun sampler quilt, and you never know what you can come up with. Because they might not be all the same blocks or the same size. Smaller blocks, you can put strips framing around them to make them the same size as bigger blocks that you've tested out. Or you could do something like this. What I did was I took a block that I had used to test out colors, and then I went into my strips and I framed it with some strips, plain strips. Then I made a checkerboard. Then I framed it with a couple more strips with cornerstones, bound it, quilted it, and instant birthday or Christmas or anything gift for a friend that is not a quilter. So that's what I call using up your scraps and having some fun with them. So now let's move on to blocks that you can make with your scraps. So I'm going to move over to an area where I have access to these blocks, and we'll keep going. So I'm back. You can make lots of different blocks from scraps and strips, real easy ones, or you can even work your way up to things that are a little bit more complicated. Of course, the easiest thing to do is make a simple 9-patch block, and this one is made from 2.5 inch strips cut up into 2.5 inch squares and sewn together. This block is 6.5 inches, waiting to be joined with others. You can also make this block by making strip sets that I have shown you in the past. Of course, here's another traditional one. This is the rail fence, where you're just joining 1.5 inch strips, 4 of them, and you're making sets of them. And as you can see, these and these are from the same strip set, and then these are from the same strip set. And then the way you set them, you get your rail fence block. Of course, there's the traditional log cabin courthouse steps block, and then of course traditional log cabin blocks that can be made with strips. And then I made this kind of funky fun one that is also actually from 1.5 inch strips. You're just piecing these sections separately and then putting them together with a 1.5 inch sashing in the middle with a little cornerstone block there, and then you get this interesting design. So you could do a lot of different things with strips and scraps. Here's one of my quilts. It's called Loop-de-Loop. I will hold this up so you can see most of it, and you'll be able to find Loop-de-Loop in my shop. Now on this pattern, as you can see, I have used 2.5 inch color print squares, and then I've taken 1.5 inch strips and cut squares out of them and did a stitch and flip corner, and you can make an interesting design with that. And this is the one that goes with it in the pattern, and those have the full loops. And then you can have something obviously like the traditional bow tie block. And these are also made from 2.5 inch and 1.5 inch squares cut from strips. Of course, the stars are not. Those are something that I added in, but it's a fun block to make. And if you have a lot of scraps lying around, you can make those. And this one has a pattern that goes with it, another bow tie pattern. And then there is my quilt called Follow the Stars, and I'll just show you the blocks from it because they're all the same block in it. But what I did with this quilt, here's the block, is I took the strips. First I made the stars, and then I used a black fabric and color print and tan print strips to make a traditional log cabin with a black kind of accent going through. And then by doing that, I can make that accent crisscross around the quilt, so you have a little bit of fun with that. And once again, you're using up your scraps. The stars can be made from bigger scraps that you have in your stash. And then, of course, your strips make up your log cabin portion. So let's move on to borders. That's another thing you can do with all of these scraps and strips. So now we're on to using these scraps for borders. So I'm going to just show you some of my quilt patterns where I have done borders with the leftover fabric. And the fun thing about using the scraps and leftover fabric is that you can make a quilt bigger if it's not as big as you want it to be when you're done with the center blocks. So this is my quilt called Country Dance, and as you can see, it's got churn dash blocks in all different colors, and then it has an interesting checkerboard block that separates those churn dash blocks. But then what I did with the scraps is I made this fun checkerboard inner border to separate out the green inner border and the green outer border. Kind of adds a little bit of interest to the quilt. Instead of just one strip of a plain color, I could have used maybe the cream and just made one strip of cream to separate the borders, but instead I used the scraps that were left over from making all the blocks and came up with this fun border. So that is an easy traditional one to do. Next up is my quilt, Scrappy North Stars. It's a very big quilt, so I can't open the big thing, but you can get an idea. It's a one block quilt, meaning that all the blocks are the same. They're the same design, but obviously not made from the same color prints. So what I did was I had a bunch of leftover fabric from these, and I wanted to make it a little bit bigger. So here you go. It's your traditional piano keyboarder. And I have it separated by a black print fabric that I used to frame the blocks when they were done. And then I got these 2.5-inch strips and made a piano key border. Now you can make this as long as you want, these piano key border strips. So if the quilt wasn't big enough, I think these were 4.5 inches long. If this didn't make your quilt big enough, you could even make them longer, and you would get a bigger quilt. So and piano key is actually a traditional kind of border, pieced border, but you can use your scraps for that. Now, my next quilt, called Wildflower Lane, it's a wall hanging. I'll hold it up here. I used the traditional log cabin block, turned it on point to make vases for these flowers, and then I wanted an interesting border, so what I did was I followed the piano key concept of the piano keys, but in groups of 3s. What I did is I took a tan print square and did a stitch and flip corner going in opposite directions per set, and then I get this, what it looks like is a flying geese kind of look, but it's also got the piano key in the back, and it also serves to give a little bit of interest to the quilt and kind of ties in with the log cabin blocks. So this one is called Wildflower Lane. My next one here is called Star Wheels. And this is another one where it's just the same style block throughout the quilt and all different colors. But notice this black element here connecting the blocks. I call those, my little name for them are houses. So I was looking for a way to make a border. So what I did was I took those little houses and made them out of the scraps left over from the blocks to make an interesting border. Instead of just a plain checkerboard or a plain piano key, now I had this interesting border that kind of tied in with the blocks. So that's another idea, is when using your scraps that are left over, take an element of the block and bring it out here and turn it into your border. So that one is Star Wheels. My final one for bigger quilts, this is kind of hard to see the whole one because it's a real big quilt, but it's called High Prairie Blooms. You kind of get the idea. There's 2 different applique blocks, and then there's a star within a turn dash, and of course those are all Scrappy. And then what I did to get a border, instead of putting something that would take away from the look of the quilt because it's so pretty with the applique, I wanted it just a plain border, but I didn't want it to be a boring just strip of fabric. So I'm going to just kind of pull this through. You can see I just did different strips of different colors plus tan and just kind of went around the quilt this way. And these are 1.5-inch strips. If you wanted the border to be wider, you could use 2.5-inch strips, and then you'd end up with a wider border, and it would make your quilt bigger. So that's High Prairie Blooms. And then lastly, you could just have a lot of fun. This is called In the Stars. And what I did with this one, it's a table runner. As you can see, the border is just a bunch of 1.5-inch strips and squares all pieced together and floating throughout the border. So you could just kind of have some crazy fun with the border. And you can see on this one, the table runner, the blocks are kind of a little more quiet, and then the border is where you get all the craziness going on. And you can tell I didn't use just fabrics that were in the blocks. I kind of raided my scrap stash for this one. And then the final thing you can do, I will show you just the example on a small quilt, but I've done this on larger quilts too, is your leftover fabric, you can use it for your binding. And this is kind of fun to do if you don't have enough fabric left of one particular color for the binding. Just cut your strips from all the different colors, piece it together for your binding, and then it kind of ties in with the blocks because I've used the colors that I used in the blocks in the fabric for the binding. So there you go. So that is my extended more tips on using your scraps that you have accumulated and to make your quilts more interesting. Once again, you can make all kinds of different blocks from scraps. You can do interesting borders, and you could also do binding. So I hope you enjoyed this little scrap quilting lesson, and come back for some more stuff later on. Thanks. Addie wanted to say hi, everybody. And she wants to remind you that you could find all my patterns at shop.snugglesquilts.com. Or you can go to my website, snugglesquilts.com, and click on the link to the shop from there. Have a great day.